in 1976, one of the executed mercenaries was a British national, said that hiring mercenaries was utterly abhorrent to our system and standards in this country. And what he was especially concerned about, he made a speech to the House of Commons, he was especially concerned that in wars of national liberation, when people were fighting for ideals, that mercenaries should be there fighting for money. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through these loopholes. And remember, I gave you those explanations for the loopholes, and I said some people would tell you there's nothing surprising. What I'm going to do is go through two of the main loopholes and explain how they actually resulted from a deep normative commitment to mercenaries based on the idea that only states should have the right to use force and that it's wrong to fight for money. Antonio Cassese, who's a very famous international lawyer, wrote an article in the late 70s where he's a chief proponent of the view that what's going on here is that states are creating law which functions in their own interests, that they created bad law on purpose so that they would be able to use mercenaries themselves. What I found is exactly the opposite. If you go through and you read what states were saying at the convention, and if anyone's interested, there's a very exciting 17-volume set of documents from the trial you can look through, is that states were very concerned about the life and death consequences of someone being caught under this article. Remember I said that you would lose your prisoner of war status and face the possibility of execution if this article applied to you. So what they were trying to do was protect national soldiers. The first loophole is the idea that mercenaries cannot be a member of the armed forces party to a conflict. You get around that loophole by enrolling in the armed forces. But states were very, very concerned that a soldier who is inspired to fight for money and fought in the national forces not be considered to be a mercenary. So that's why they put this clause in. They figured, how do we protect our national soldiers? Well, we differentiate them from mercenaries, and we say national soldiers, permanent parts of the armed forces, are not considered to be mercenaries. And one of the reasons to do this was to exclude a variety of very long-standing permanent arrangements whereby foreigners fought in other armies. So we have the case of the Gurkhas fighting for the British Army, the French and Spanish foreign legions, and indeed the behavior of states in alliances where individuals might go fight for a foreign state. So what happens with this loophole is actually a very protective attempt on the parts of states to make sure that they were going to devise this really tough article, but they were going to protect their own soldiers from falling into it. The second major loophole that I mentioned is the loophole about motivation. So the idea that mercenaries, we can tell who a mercenary is because they're motivated by money. This is fascinating because what we see here is that states firmly believed that what a mercenary was someone who fought for hard cash. And in fact, the term hard cash comes up repeatedly in these discussions. That's how we know who a mercenary is, and that's what makes a mercenary wrong, is that they're fighting for money. States were unwilling to water down this commitment. They could have created a law which made no reference to motivation whatsoever, and yet they insisted on including it because they believed if they didn't, the definition of a mercenary would be meaningless. And in fact, they suspected that it might not work. And there are all sorts of discussions of people saying, well, you know, but what happens if this doesn't work? What happens if we can't prove that someone is financially motivated? And the conclusion was that even though that was quite likely, that the definition had to reflect what a mercenary was and why people assumed that mercenaries were bad and in need of legal control. And that was the idea that they were financially motivated. The problem with this is that it's totally legally unworkable. So in the 1976 case that I mentioned before in Angola, where the British mercenary was executed, the British government called for governmental inquiry, which was led by one of the law lords, Lord Diplock. And he released a very long report in which he focused and said, any new legislation that the UK creates cannot focus on motivation because we can't prove motivation in a court of law. It's too difficult to demonstrate that out of all the wide range of motives someone might have for entering into conflict, that financial motivation is the biggest one. Now, this was in 1976. The framers of Article 47 were meeting between 1974 and 1977, and they were aware of the Diplock report. And they decided the way around it was to put in the higher pay provision. That, okay, Lord Diplock might be right, you know, it might be hard to do this motivation thing, but we see the way around it. And what we'll do is include the idea that a mercenary is someone who's not only motivated by hard cash, but actually gets paid more than other soldiers. What's really weird about this emphasis on motive is the whole rationale behind creating the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions was to cover a very wide range of actors on the international battlefield. So the idea was you want to protect, we're going to accept the fact that people are going to fight. It's bad, we don't necessarily like it, but we're going to accept the fact that it happens. But once they're actually fighting, then we're going to worry about what they're doing. So the additional protocols are all about not looking at people's motive for fighting. They're all about saying people will fight, we're just concerned with what they actually do. But this article within the additional protocol is all about why people fight. There's nothing here and nothing in the definition which I showed before about what mercenaries actually do. They're only about who mercenaries are. So states, in the course of creating this massive document of international law, it's like Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the others. And this is the thing which is not like the others. It doesn't match up. And I would argue that there were two routes that states could have taken in creating this article. They could have regulated mercenaries on the basis of their activities. So we don't like mercenaries because mercenaries engage in coups, because mercenaries try and suppress national liberation movements, because mercenaries conduct assassinations. They could have made a wide range of mercenary activity illegal, but they didn't do that. They chose to make mercenaries illegal on the basis of their status, on the basis of who they were. And that shows that they were concerned about what mercenaries were, and they were concerned about what mercenaries were because they were morally uncomfortable with the idea. They took a far less efficient course. It would have been much easier to create law on the basis of activities, but they chose to create law on the fact of being a mercenary. And in fact, there is a quote in the Travaux Preparatoires which says, "We are concerned it is the fact of being a mercenary which is repugnant." Doesn't matter what they do. And in the UN Convention, which comes later, there is a great debate about the difference between good mercenaries and bad mercenaries. And finally, someone sticks up their hand and says, there's no difference between good mercenaries and bad mercenaries. They're all bad. Doesn't matter what they do. It's impossible to imagine a situation where a mercenary might do a good thing. So what we have here is we have two of the loopholes in that law, which exist purely because states knew exactly what they found morally concerning about mercenaries, and were trying to create law which reflected that concern. And what they ended up with, which is the law that absolutely doesn't work. And this confounds our expectations about international law in all sorts of interesting ways, and has all sorts of interesting practical effects. I started out by saying some people in international relations would not find it unexpected in the slightest that international law is weak. There are also a group of people in international relations who are optimists about international law and about norms. They think that both norms and formal laws exist and that they influence states in their behavior. So states do pay attention to law. The vast majority of these international relations optimists believe that if you have a norm, if you have an unwritten rule, the thing you have to do is make it into a law. That transferring your norm, this general sense that I was describing that we have out there about why we're uncomfortable about mercenaries, you need to transform that into a hard, written down international law. And there are all sorts of reasons why this might have beneficial effects for the status of a norm. People who look at norms started out by focusing on human rights norms. This is one of the major areas that they started out on. And what they identified were a bunch of people called norm entrepreneurs, and that's somebody who's an activist, who goes out and tries to get their norm enshrined in law. You would try and get your norm, if you were a norm entrepreneur, you would get it institutionalized, you would make it into a law, and this is often called the process of legalization, pretty straightforward. And you would want to do it because it prevents retrogression. So if you're a human rights activist, you get your human rights law written down, and it prevents the international community from moving backwards and committing human rights transgressions. And also, it gives you a further platform. And we see this very clearly in the case of human rights. You start on one issue, and you can spread your norm throughout a whole variety of other issues. And you can only do that if you make it into law. The other reason why making law might be a really good idea is it makes a norm more precise and it makes it more clear. This stops people from arguing about it. So in the case of the human rights norms, you define exactly what you mean by a human right. You put it in a UN convention, people can't argue about it anymore. And you set out the consequences for violation. You say, here's our norm, we're going to make it into law, and if you violate this law, these are the following things which will happen to you. So these international relations optimists are totally convinced that if you want your norm to spread, you want it to keep going, you don't want it to go backwards, what you need to do is make an international law. Well, all of that stuff that I just mentioned before seems to suggest that making your norm into law isn't actually necessarily a good thing. Now, these people who talk about institutionalization of norms and legalization, they use a lot of metaphors. They use metaphors of this is an evolution, this is a life cycle. which suggests that legalization is a step, a progressive step,